So I want to begin by acknowledging Wiradjuri country and Wiradjuri people who are here today, and particularly I want to thank you for teaching me about Yindamara, the power of doing things slowly. So I was meant to be a lawyer, right? That's at least was my plan when I was 11 years old. I'd worked it out over many Saturday nights spent on the couch with my grandma, watching a TV show about lawyers called Rumpole of the Bailey. Look, for anyone who's young, Rumpole was a bit like Suits, but not sexy. I was pretty serious about it, and when I finished school, I enrolled in a law degree and got a job working for a lawyer. But in my second year of university, when I was 19 years old, mental illness shattered my plan. I had a psychosis and I was put in the psychiatric ward of a public hospital for 2 months. It was confusing and terrifying and banal. We'd try and lighten the mood. Sometimes we would perform Nurse Ratched impressions when it was medication time, but it was still one of the worst experiences of my life. In the days before I was discharged from hospital, I overheard my doctor talking to my parents. He said, "She's unlikely to make a full recovery." No one had ever been that direct with me. All I got was platitudes and false hope. They probably thought that the truth would be too much. But as it turned out, hearing those words changed my life. Look, I don't want to sugarcoat the pain that comes from feeling like my life was over. But there was more than just pain. There were questions like, if my life as it was over, then who else could I be? And there was a reckoning. If my life could be upended so quickly before it had even really begun, I had to focus on what actually mattered. It didn't take long for me to ditch the idea of becoming a lawyer. I replaced it with trying to change the world. I gravitated towards things that moved me. I got involved in the student movement's fight against rising university fees because I knew what a life changer higher education could be. As a kid, my dad did a free education economics degree, and it changed my family's life. I helped build the movement to try and stop the war in Iraq, as opposed to Iraq, the one a few years ago, honouring my grandma's stories of war and living through the Blitz. But our failure to stop that war gave me a new question. I wanted to find new and better ways to make a difference. I helped set up GetUp to experiment with online campaigning. I did a PhD in coalition. I was very serious, right? A PhD in coalition building and researched around the world. And that led me to find community organising. Having spent my 20s searching in my 30s, I set out to build Australia's largest and most diverse community coalition. The Sydney Alliance was brimming with ambition, a people's response to the Cronulla riots, a way for unions to keep connected with communities after your rights at work. The Alliance took a relationship-driven way of making a difference that had begun in the United States and had been taken to the United Kingdom, but had never been successfully tried here. We built something really big, 49 organisations. It was unusually diverse. The Jewish Board of Deputies and the Cancer Council, the Nurses Union and the Muslim Women's Association. These were organisations that didn't only not really know each other, they often didn't really even like each other, but they could see that they had a common fate in the city in which they lived. What I loved most about organising was how it understood the art of making a difference. It wasn't just trying to win some big new policy or change some new law, but it was more seeing social change like a struggle up a mountain. The pioneer of community organising, a guy called Saul Alinsky, described it. If making a difference is like climbing a mountain, then we must visualise a mountain with no top. When we see the top, and we climb on up, and the overcast rises, and we merely find ourselves on a bluff. The mountain continues on up. Now we see the real top ahead of us and strive up the mountain further to only realise we're at another bluff. The top's still above us, and it goes on and on interminably. I felt like I had been on an open-ended climb since recovering from my psychosis, and community organising finally felt like a fit. But I still had bipolar. I know you want this to be a happy story, but look where we are. This isn't the night for stories that end in happily ever after. For years I struggled with my mental illness while running the Alliance, but it was a stressful job, and after 9 years, I had a second psychosis. But that was not the worst of it. After my recovery, at my return to work meeting, I met with the Sydney Alliance board. In a meeting that lasted no more than 7 minutes, I was told I no longer had a job. I was sacked by my own creation for having a mental illness. At the time, I didn't have words to describe what had happened, but now I see it as grief. The word grief derives from the Latin word meaning to be burdened, and the grief I carried had so many dimensions. It was practical. I urgently needed a new job. It was emotional. I lost so many of my friends when I lost the Alliance. So many people I had known stepped back and away when all this happened. And there was also a rumour mill of stories about how crazy and unstable I was. There was also the banality of recovery, the manic depressive aftershocks in the years that followed the psychosis, the endless search for good or less bad medicine that brought with it all manner of cruel side effects like weight gain, acne, tongue spasms and broken digestion, a parade of new doctors and therapists, exercise plans, mindfulness courses, endless attempts to use personal responsibility strategies to try and manage my fitful mind. But these immediate challenges gave way to a bigger and more overwhelming grief. The realisation that what had ended was not just my job, but the plan I had for my life. Recovering from a psychosis at 19 had given me a vision of the change maker I wanted to be. But decades later, mental illness stripped me of any hope I had of realising that dream. It was a heavy sadness. I still feel it. But as I walked forward, I also found that carrying that loss created its own kind of space where other things could grow. 3 years after they sacked me, the Sydney Alliance held an event with 100 community leaders where they publicly apologised for what they had done. At that event, for the first time, I spoke at length about what it was like to live and work with bipolar. The day was miraculous. It is so much easier for either side of a conflict to blame and to shield themselves with righteousness and anger than it is to open the door to reconciliation. But there was more than that. Having the chance to share my loss, my grief, my burden, created the space for something new. It was that time when I first started to realise that my experience of living with mental illness had a lot to teach about how to make a difference. I could see how my so-called private mental illness, my private shame, was deeply connected to public life. Not only did public life at work with its stress and challenges affect my private mental health, but what I'd been forced to grapple with grief and uncertainty about learning to live with loss, had something to say about the challenge of being a social change mountain climber. I struggled as a mountain climber, but I'm not the only one. I had a private adversary in my mental illness. But we have no shortage of existential adversaries in the bigger public world as well. Take your pick. Climate change, war and devastation, Gaza, Ukraine, the rest of the Middle East, inequality, terrorism, right-wing populism, geopolitical meltdown, a mental health system that is literally breaking under crisis. But when these issues are talked about in public, the daily conversation is nothing short of a sanitised denialism. It's like platitudes. She'll be right. Don't you worry. You can vote for a politician who'll fix it for you. Sign up to an NGO and they can lobby for you. Be Be a good consumer, do your bit for climate and buy an electric car. Or you could put your faith in green tech or AI or an abundant market, and that'll sort it out. The message is someone else has got this. It reminds me of having bipolar and being told by the medical system that they knew what they were doing. But whether we are talking about the crises in the world or the crises in our mental health, we know this isn't true. But we often cling to this false hope because the overwhelming scale of the crises that we are facing is making us more and more aware of the limits of our ability to act and make a difference. That dawning realization, that burden, sounds a lot like grief. To prepare ourselves to live with our limits while we make a difference, we can learn a lot from those who have learnt to live with mental illness. In the same way that the doctor told my parents that I might not recover, we too face the genuine possibility that our public life, our climate, our people may not recover. It's not just that when we try and make a difference that it might not work out. It's a deeper truth that even as we try and make change, we may be striving for better while the big things in the world get worse. That no matter how hard we try, like me trying to find the right medication, we may never find a way back to the world that we thought was possible. How do you climb that mountain? Those of us that live with mental illness are a walking reminder that it is still worth trying to make the climb. When it comes to making a difference in the world, climbing is not about where you end up. Climbing is about each step you take. The sacred act is the act of climbing at all. We too often get trapped in the mindset that making a difference is about changing the world out there. But when we do that, we overlook the small work, the relationships, the learning, the connection that happens to us right here when we try and bring a better world into being. We don't need to give up on big goals, but we need to learn how to hold them differently. When I realised I couldn't be the change-making doer I hoped to be, I started to find ways to make a difference that honoured my limits. I could no longer be the one trying to run up the mountain, but I could be someone that could research and teach and mentor and write about how to make a difference. I could help others prepare for the climb. We are all mountain climbers. We just don't know which mountain we have to climb. It's why nights like this are so important. Not just because they bring the experience of suicide and mental illness into the light, but because when we do, we bring the insights and lessons that come from our grief, from our personal struggles with mental illness. We bring them into the world in ways that can actually help us all. Thank you.